Hello, friends. Welcome. Welcome to all of you in this very serious and grave period of time for this briefing on this on the food crisis that has been precipitated by the crisis in Ukraine. I will give you an overview of the program that we are going to have. We have top global experts here. But before that, I just want to let you know that this program is being recorded, and this would be available for others who could not join. Then also, when you're not speaking, kindly keep your mic muted. And if you would like to ask questions, we will have times during the presentations for Q&A. Kindly put the questions in the chat box. And if you have any technical issues, please write in the chat box. Friends, I would like to just give you an overview of this the program. We will be welcomed by Marianne, the WCC Director of Communications, and then we'll begin with a prayer by Bishop Rosemary Venner of the World Methodist Council. Then we will have, in the part one, we'll have two key inputs from Dr. David Navarro, who's the co-lead of the UN Global Crisis Response Group and the Special Envoy of WHO Director General for COVID-19. Then following that, we will have a short Q&A period. Then we'll have Sofia Monsalve, Secretary General of FIAN International, who is also a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food and Food Systems. And then we'll have a short Q&A session. Then in part two, we'll have 5 key brief input from Dr. Thorsten, Mervin from South Africa. Thorsten is from ACT Alliance, and Reverend Nick Talubale, then from the OAIC, Organization of African Instituted Churches, Catligo, and Silva, who are youth activists, and an input from Dr. Esther Mombo. Following that, we will have discussions as well before we close. So I hand over the proceedings to our WCC Director of Communication, Marianne.
Thank you very much, Manoj, for the introduction. Excellencies, eminences, distinguished guests, and colleagues worldwide, on behalf of the Acting General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, Reverend Professor Dr. Johan Sauka, I welcome you to the WCC briefing on global crisis on food and the crisis response. The WCC are working for unity, justice, and peace, and representing 352 churches in 120 countries and for 580 million Christians worldwide. WCC has a long-standing commitment to work on food security with its Food for Life campaign, and has recently been invited to the Global Crisis Response Group's Food Workstream Network. They meet each week to monitor the situation around the world. Our briefing today will feature experts who will offer crucial updates on the global food crisis, as well as a summary of urgent response from faith-based groups, civil society, and governments. A new global crisis is emerging from the war in Ukraine, with the potential to cause millions of people to go hungry, push food prices higher, and spark unrest far from the conflict zone. As 811 million people go to bed hungry every night, the number of those facing acute food insecurity has more than doubled from 135 million to 276 million since 2019. The war in Ukraine has cut off supplies from Ukraine's ports, which once exported vast amounts of cooking oil as well as maize and wheat. This has reduced the global supply and caused the price of alternatives to soar. Global food prices are almost 30% higher than the same time last year. Russia and Ukraine produce 30% of the world's wheat supply, and prior to the war, Ukraine was seen as the world breadbasket, exporting 4.5 million tons of agricultural produce per month through its ports. Together, Russia and Ukraine account for more than a quarter of the global wheat supplies, exporting to countries including Egypt, Lebanon, Turkey, Yemen, and Somalia, among many other countries. These are the most vulnerable populations in the world, so the consequences are extremely high due to the rising prices for food, fuel, and other goods. The war has worsened food insecurity in poorer nations due to the rising prices. Some countries could face long-term famines if Ukraine's exports are not restored to the pre-war levels. We know that young children are most affected, with many of them facing severe malnutrition. A large number have also dropped out of school as the food shortage bite. Overall, food insecurity has generally compromised children's health, welfare, and protection in the regions. I quote the Anglican Bishop Daniel Kampisha in the northern Kenya from an article published recently in the WCC. With no food, many of the children are going to school on empty stomachs, and with no food at school, they are missing all the necessary meals that they need, and therefore their education is highly affected. In all its dimensions, the war in Ukraine is producing a downward spiral effect on the world economy already battered by COVID-19 and the climate crisis, with particular dramatic impacts on developing countries. The world's most vulnerable people are most impacted. Let's act together. Once again, welcome to this first briefing, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Now I invite Bishop Rosemary Venner to give a brief prayer.
Thank you, Manoj, and thank you to the WCC for calling us together on this urgent topic in this time. Let us pray. Psalm 145 reads, "The eyes of all look to you, God, and you give them their food in due season. God of life, you provide plenty of water, wheat, rice, fruits, vegetables. You care for what you created. You weep with each one of the children, youth, and adults starving, longing for something to eat, dying because of malnutrition and hunger. You mourn with those who suffer because of armed conflicts and war and natural disasters caused by climate change. God of justice, we have failed to serve as good stewards of Mother Earth. We waste natural resources, exploit planet Earth, fight against one another, stick indifferently to toxic economic systems, and do not hear the cries of the needy. Forgive us, O God. Lead us to radical conversation. Remind us of who you are and who you call us to be. You, God, have given us yourself in Jesus Christ, bread of life. Teach us to follow Jesus. Your Holy Spirit is at work, transforming hearts of stone into hearts of flesh. Transform us, Holy Spirit, so that we compassionately see your face in those who are starving. God, we ask for wisdom as we today engage in reflections how to face the increasing hunger crisis. Teach us how to challenge those in power, how to share the goods of Mother Earth, and how to work for justice for all. The eyes of all look to you, God, and you give them their food in true season. We trust your promises, God, and we commit ourselves to be co-workers in your economy of life. Here we are. Bless us and make us a blessing. This we pray in the name of Jesus, our brother and our hope. Amen.
Thank you very much, Bishop, for your leadership and for your consistent leadership on this issue. You have led us in the prayer and ACT network work last year. And we look forward to for your leadership, continuing leadership. I now would like to invite Dr. David Navarro. He is the co-lead of the UN Global Crisis Response Group and a special envoy of the WHO Director General for COVID-19. He has been a great leader, and from many decades, he has been in the forefront of fighting and supporting human welfare in health and food. I've given his details in the chat box, and just to say that in October 2018, David received the World Food Prize together with Lawrence Haddad for their leadership in building coalitions for action for better nutrition access for sustainable development goals. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much indeed, Manoj. In the prayer, there was a statement about failure in stewardship of the world's resources and lack of justice in how the benefits from these resources are made available to humanity. As I here sit before you, I think it's important that at the beginning of my remarks, I share with you, as somebody who's been trying to work on food issues for quite a long time, an awful sense of shame and failure, especially as what I'm about to tell you is really so serious. And I only wish that it wasn't like this. We have to start, I fear, from where things are. But we should never assume that that means that we are absolved from blame for the situation as it is. A world with so much food, so much opportunity, so much potential, and yet so much suffering, which looks like it's going to get worse. So things started to look really not good globally, to me, in the middle of last year, listening to many ministers of agriculture coming together at a meeting in Rome in July, just one after the other saying, it's not working. Climate change, COVID-19, and conflict are making the food security of our peoples just really disturbing. Global trade systems are not working right. Countries that are dependent on imports because of the COVID-19 crisis, not able to get what they need. Farmers, because of climate change and COVID-19, particularly smallholder farmers and fishers, unable to produce what they need, unable to get it to market, and unable to get recompense for it. And so we were hearing even then that it's not good. And I want to say that we knew in the middle of last year that things were not going right. Perhaps because of COVID, there was an increase in conflict with more and more instances of societies affected by mistrust, just unable to find peaceful ways of resolving difficulty. And by the turn of the year, January 2022, we were anticipating that this was going to be a terrible year for poor people, for farmers, for small and medium enterprises on which they depend, particularly for women, children, indigenous people, disabled people, people with needs. They were going to suffer. And then in February, an additional and quite disturbing, extremely disturbing new development, this war which immediately led to speculative action on global markets because of the role that Ukraine has in providing quite a lot of the food that's exported, particularly wheat and oilseeds, and that in turn almost immediately led to an enormous jump in prices. And then in addition, although we've been hoping that there would be a reduced dependence on chemical fertilizers, the fact is that quite a lot of food production does depend on fertilizer right now. And the difficulty with accessing fertilizer became clear immediately because of the importance of Russia and Belarus in producing potash. And that led, again, probably influenced by speculators, to an immediate rise in fertilizer prices. Taken together, climate change, the continuing inequity around COVID-19, conflict and cost increases have precipitated a situation which is going to lead to such enormous suffering. The Global Crisis Response Group was set up by Antonio Guterres in the middle of March on the following premise. He said, I don't want poor people, particularly in poor places, to suffer because of things over which they have had no involvement at all. Climate change, the inequities around COVID-19, and the conflicts, particularly the conflict in the Black Sea region. And he asked several of us to come together to just explore what are the possibilities for trying to reduce the suffering. Well, so first of all, he asked us to look at the links between food, energy, and finance, and to see whether or not we could actually start to explore what needs to happen in finance and in energy to improve access to food, and vice versa. He asked us to try to anticipate the countries where structural factors make people particularly liable to be exposed to these challenges of hunger and of malnutrition, as well as disempowerment and the inability to realize their rights. And then he asked us to go even further and to explore which peoples and which farming systems and which communities were most in danger. And then to work with all the global institutions that exist to try to provide support, and then the regional bodies, and then national governments, to prioritize the interests of those who are liable to suffer and who are already suffering as this cost of living crisis takes root everywhere. We produced our first assessment in the middle of April and immediately identified more than 100 countries that are structurally vulnerable. That assessment was taken to the spring meetings of the World Bank and IMF, where the UN Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General pleaded with the governors of these institutions to find easier ways with less conditions and less dependency for people in poor countries and for governments of poor countries to be helped through this crisis. The Secretary General argued that countries have been so weakened by trying to protect their people from the effects of COVID-19 and from the impacts of climate change, both of which happened not as a result of their actions. And we tried to find ways to make it more rapid and more certain that countries could widen the fiscal space so that they could protect their people. And it's not yet happening. It's going, I think, to open up, but it's not enough. And then during the last few days at another meeting in Switzerland, where a number of leaders have come together. The effort has focused on trying to find ways to get more resources to come into non-governmental groups, to civil society, to faith groups, to the Red Cross movement, and to large NGOs as well as farmer organizations, so that there is a possibility that those who can reach the people who are suffering can actually have the resources that are necessary to help them out. We're not there yet. Our second report, which focuses on the challenges people face, focuses on how they're between a rock and a hard place. The rock of rising prices and the hard place of the sequelae of COVID-19 and climate change. We see women, children, older persons, indigenous peoples, refugees, displaced people, and many others needing special attention now. We do not believe that the answer is simply to increase the money available for humanitarian assistance so that these people are turned into beneficiaries, brought into centers, fed food provided as if by charity. That's not the way. We believe that there are hundreds of millions of people at risk now who need a global effort at social protection, safety nets, but most of all, opportunities for them to take things into their own hands, to have autonomy and agency and be able to realize their rights so that they can improve the situation for themselves. And we know that we're trying to do this in a world where the structures are not exactly making this easy. And we come to you, all of you, and ask you to advise us on how we can do the best we possibly can to avert an absolute tsunami of suffering and distress and misery, which we believe is ahead of us if we do not find the way to reduce it and to make it so that we don't look back on 2022 as the year where there was a crisis of civilization, because building on the pandemic, humanity just could not find a way to promote equity, the realization of rights, and the well-being of not just people, but our beautiful planet, so that we can offer it to future generations as a place of hope and a place of growth. Thank you very much indeed. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. I was wondering whether you will be able to stay for a few more minutes, because you said you will have to leave by 12:30. So if we can...
I'd like to, yes, please, till 12:40. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So if we can give a few minutes, up to between 5 and 10 minutes for some questions before Sophie comes in, so that you will have the time to answer to them. So if you have questions, please either you can unmute yourself and ask, or write in the chat. It will be better because we have a number of people. So if you can ask your questions. And there was one question that was already asked by Gary Baldwin, a dairy farmer from New Zealand, in advance. He was, of course, as a farmer, saying that, you know, farmers are spending a lot of resources, you know, and paying much more for fertilizer, etc., and seeds and chemicals. So the rising prices are bad for consumers, but it may be sometimes important for farmers to get a fair price for the food they produce. So your comments on that, please.
The farmers' organizations that we've listened to, particularly in the last month, have all said to us their input costs are increasing astronomically. Several have told us that they just are so unsure of getting a fair price that there's no way they're going to borrow or dip into their savings to pay the higher costs. because they don't think they'll be able to get them back. So their reaction is to plant less, or to rear fewer animals, or in some other way, to basically reduce their exposure. And that's not good for the farmers. It's not good for farming communities. It's not good for the small and medium enterprise network on which the whole rural structures depend in so many countries. But it's also very worrying because it means that shortages are likely to continue into 2023, into 2024, and indeed that this will lead to longer term difficulties. It will also lead to more and more farmers deciding to stop being farmers, or fewer and fewer people to come into farming. And one of our big fears is that this will be another excuse for an exodus of people from rural areas. Altogether, I believe it's correct. And it really is important that as a society, we ask ourselves what can be done to increase the reward that farmers get for their work, and to avoid this situation where farmers come to us and say, we just can't afford to do it. We can't afford to go on, because that's not good for the future. Thank you.
There are two people who have raised their hands, Reverend Nikta Lubale and then Willie. So Reverend Nikta, and in between, there was also a question in the chat saying that, would it be possible for boats under the UN flag to sail through the Russian blockade and retrieve the food in Odessa? So that is a question that has come up, but Nikta, please.
Thank you so much, David, and for your leadership. It's good to see you to be part of the global crisis group leadership. Maybe one thing in the process of leading this together with the UN and others, can the G7, G20, and all those who are pledging for resources for arms and ammunitions also pledge for the support of the initiatives towards food security, because we are seeing much more a response to the supply of arms than with little response to support the people who are suffering because of what is going on. Number one, climate change, as you've mentioned, COVID, and now the conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you very much indeed for this comment. I'm so glad you made it, because what's happening is, firstly, a lot of countries have increased their defense spending, and they take it away from their own social services and safety nets. They take it away from international development assistance. And so where the money should be going, it's not going, and instead it's buying weapons. In addition, we just heard that a number of countries that actually include some that are getting wealthier as a result of this crisis have decided to cut back on aid and to put the money instead into managing Ukrainian refugees in their own space, justifying that this is an appropriate use of their aid budget. It's not. And so anybody who can, either through their parishioners or through their networks, start a very strong drumbeat to argue against the movement of development aid into arms, or even into management of refugees locally, could you please do so? The Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed, took the unusual step of criticizing a country that is normally highly supportive to the UN system for the cutback in development aid and the cutback in resources for key United Nations agencies that are so important at this time. It's a massive worry to us. Thank you for raising the point. I'd just like to answer one other question, Manoj, in the chat very quickly. Yes, the United Nations is doing everything possible to get grain out of Odessa so that the silos can be emptied to receive in this year's harvest, because they're currently absolutely full. But they can't get the grain out of Odessa for a lot of reasons, which I will not go into. The United Nations is trying with various forms of diplomacy, quite careful and quiet, but it's extremely difficult. And we hope that there will be a lot of public, quiet support for a real long-term effort to get that grain out, not just now, but in the future, to keep Odessa open, but at the same time to try to find ways to stop that actually leading to an intensification of the conflict. Thank you for that question as well.
Willie Langji.
Yeah, thank you, Nikta. I think you asked my question. Just to add that it's unfortunate that we are seeing more resources going to arms sales and people, some countries, and actually not countries, but arms companies getting richer when everybody else is suffering. So just to add to what Nikta was saying, I think it feels like we are in a situation where we may not be able to even achieve what we're thinking or talking about here, because there's already that blockade and that attention that is intentionally deviated from the real crisis, which has been going on for long, into making profits or into the arms companies instead of solving that problem. So thank you for asking that question again, Nikta.
Could I just say that, Willie, that Mr. Guterres doesn't mince his words. He's described the war in Ukraine as evil, unacceptable, and an absurdity in these modern times. He does not understand how it proved possible in 2022 for a war of this seriousness and destructive potential to be taking place. He wonders what has happened to us as a civilization.
Neil Arma, please ask your question.
Thank you very much for the presentation, David. Well, indeed, the topic is very significant for us to discuss, especially looking at the various things that are going on globally. My question is, through the assessment that was done by the UN, was there a consideration to empower local production of fertilizer in the instance where potassium supply from Ukraine has been reduced, from Russia has been reduced? Is there a way where, through the partnership of international organizations such as the IMF and the United Nations, countries can be empowered in the local production of fertilizer? For us here in Ghana, in the Presbyterian of Ghana, we have tried starting that with some local farmers, and we can see that there is a huge call for that. So I just wanted to find out if that has been also considered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. Recently, I met with some young entrepreneurs from Ghana who explained to me that this provides an opportunity for them to work with farmers, but also with those who are in other parts of the food supply chain, to really develop compost and other organic soil nutrient capacities, and then to present them actually as viable alternatives to chemical fertilizer. And it's very interesting to feel that there is a change underway. I certainly have been saying and expressing strongly within the Global Crisis Response Group my wish that every possible action is taken to encourage those who are working on alternatives to chemical approaches to soil nutrition to take them forward. And I'm so glad that you mentioned you were from Ghana, and it gave me the excuse to say that I hope that we can find ways, as well as obviously seeking to improve farmers' access to fertilizers. We've heard that there's a gap, the value of something like $75 million right now. So obviously there's a need to try to help farmers in your country access fertilizers at an affordable cost, but also to stimulate the entrepreneurs who are finding better ways of working with what we call organic nutrition. And thank you so much for raising it. And actually, you've empowered me to take this further in my discussions with those who are offering support. Thank you again.
Dr. Kepfri Lakoya asked you, David, from assessment that was carried out on most vulnerable regions, which region or countries are the most vulnerable?
Thank you very much indeed, Manoj. This is really difficult. Of course, the situation in Eastern Africa right now is very, very disturbing indeed, because there has been such a failure of the rains affecting parts of Ethiopia, parts of Somalia, and parts of Kenya. And now it's going on, and other parts of Eastern Africa seem to be in trouble as well. It's a bit patchy. And I said parts of, that doesn't mean that I'm saying in public that whole countries are in difficulty. But I'm also hearing of real challenges right across the Sahel, parts of countries in that belt from Mauritania to Mali to Niger, Burkina Faso and Chad. I'm also hearing of other countries in Western Africa that are facing difficulty. Again, it's patchy. And then I hear of concerns in Pakistan with the heat and the impact of the heat on wheat production. And then again, the result of floods that have affected India. In fact, everywhere you look, there are worries. And it's not just in Africa and Asia and Latin America, it's also in countries in the Northern Hemisphere as well. I don't really want to say there is one place that's worse than others, because what we're seeing everywhere we look is that there are really worrisome situations affecting poorer people, smallholder farmers, agricultural laborers, indigenous peoples everywhere. Go to the United Kingdom, go to USA, go to Canada. There are people hurting everywhere. It's because not so much the country as a whole, it's because of the place of these people in their societies, their ability to realize their rights, their ability to have autonomy and sovereignty. That's where the problem seems to lie as we see it. Thank you.
I think, thank you so much, David. There were also many other comments coming in. I mean, talking about also Sri Lanka was raised as one of the big challenges and linking it to the economic crisis. Maybe you have a word, the last word on that before you leave.
So, I mean, the really important thing is that we need to be very careful how the situation in Sri Lanka is presented. Some have described it as a result of a hasty decision by a government, a popular decision to shift from the use of chemical inputs to an organic production system. But it's not that simple. There are many structural and locational challenges. Plus there's the impact of COVID. And so I want a much more careful analysis of the situation in Sri Lanka. Don't portray it as a failed experiment in organic agriculture. The real difficulty is Sri Lanka now has to go cap in hand to the international system to get credit because it's defaulted on its debt. And that's a terrible situation for the government and people of Sri Lanka, because it's so hard to get a loan or indeed to get a grant when you've defaulted on debt. And we all need to give all our strength and encouragement to Sri Lankans as they navigate their way through this, and ask those who've got the money to not impose lots more conditions that might work against the interests of the people and the country.
Thank you very much, David. We have taken a lot of your time, and we know that you have to move on to another meeting. We are really grateful, especially to address our member churches and our networks and your leadership for the work stream on food on this crisis. And we are assuring you full support, and to channel our feedback to your your expertise and the team that works with you. Thank you so much, and wish you all God's blessings for your work.
Thank you very much. I'd like to stay a little bit longer. I would like to hear Sophia very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Now we move on to Sophia Monsalve, who is the Secretary General of FIAN International, the leading international human rights organization working for the right to food and nutrition. She is also a member of the international panel of experts on sustainable food systems. We'll give you her full the bio in the chat box. But to know that she is the voice that is responding from the communities on this crisis, and from FIAN and from IPES, we have reports already, and the links have been given in the chat box. Please, you should read that. And I invite Sophia, thank you so much for coming at such short notice. Please, I hand over the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Manoj, and good afternoon, good evening, good day to all of you. Thank you very much also to WCC for this invitation to share with you today some of our thoughts and reflections around the extremely painful and problematic crisis. Let me start by saying that in the two reports that were circulated, perhaps the first question to ask is, when did this crisis started? And I think this is an important conversation, because for some of us, we have been in crisis since 2007, if you remember the first big food crisis that we had at that time. And the structural drivers of this food crisis, for instance, the inequality in terms of controlling land and natural resources, the inequalities in terms of tax justice, the issue of debt has been mentioned in the chat, and the simply impossible burden on many countries in order to serve, for instance, their human rights obligations with social rights, public health systems, public education systems has become impossible, because serving the debt is the top priority of an international system which is forcing these countries to do so. Conflict, climate and ecological destructions are also part of these structural issues. A global food trade system which is deeply flawed, and it is actually not functioning anymore. So I think it is very important to recall what are the structural drivers of this crisis. Because if we don't do so, then we may end up in focusing on very narrow responses to the crisis. And this is, I think, our deep concern. So therefore, we are calling in our report also to have a conversation, because we are unfortunately foreseeing that the situation will get worse and worse, that we need to have a shared understanding at the global level. What is a food crisis? When to call for special measures, because there is a food crisis. The FAO and other UN institutions have very sophisticated systems of identifying emergencies at national level, but we don't have an international level, something like this. In fact, civil society organizations were calling the Committee on World Food Security to declare a food crisis related to COVID-19. And it was impossible to get this committee, the CFS, to work on a coordinated response to the food crisis related to the COVID pandemic. And it was so because some powerful countries, mainly agro-exporting countries, don't like to have global coordinated policy responses. So this is unfortunately the reality that we have to live with. And I think these very countries have been also blocking other structural changes that need to happen. That, for instance, curb speculation. We need to roll back speculation. And for that, we need to regulate the financial markets. We need to regulate the agriculture future markets. But these countries don't want to do so. And they think that it is fine to rely and to depend on a global food system, a global food security strategy, which is over-dependent on global food supply chains and trade. And I think this has been another very problematic dimension of the current crisis, that the World Bank and many international financial institutions convince countries or force them to dismantle their own national capacity to produce food, to store food, to have food, public food programs for distribution, for schools, and for many other things. And therefore, they were told that it is better to rely on the global market. But now, since COVID, we have seen that these global food supply chains are extremely vulnerable to disruptions because of climate conditions or because of geopolitical and war issues as we see now. So therefore, we think that this conversation about what are the structural causes of the current food crisis is extremely important in order to identify what should be the solutions and the way forward. So therefore, we invite you to read our reports, to put your own thinking, because on many of these issues, I think how to deal with multiple shocks. This is the reality that our people are facing. It's not sufficient anymore to just to respond to the food crisis. We need to deal with this multiple crisis at the same time. And I think it is a very welcome step that the UN Secretary General has put this food group crisis to respond to these multiple shocks, because of course, finances and food are very closely related, and it's very important to do so. The civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism of the Committee on World Food Security is also participating in this response group set up by the UN Secretary General. We have welcomed a lot that he is willing to listen to the views of people on the ground, of grassroots communities, and therefore we decided to join this group. Now, we think that it is very important. Unfortunately, the first briefing that this group has produced is missing. I mean, it hasn't addressed yet the structural causes of the current crisis. It's still focusing a lot on global food supply chains. It's not calling for reviewing that policy, for strengthening the local, national, and regional capacities to feed themselves of all the peoples, to support a transition to agroecology. So therefore, this is the thing, the aspects that we are missing in that briefing. And it is very concerning because we see that the United Nations and different agencies like FAO have been exposed in the last years to increasing corporate capture, meaning that transnational corporations are getting a lot of influence in these agencies through donations, through joint partnerships and the like. And we have, for instance, we are tracking what is actually the structure of these partnerships in the FAO with transnational corporations. We haven't seen that, for instance, associations like CropLife or the International Fertilizers Association are actually giving funds to FAO or having joint programs. Now, for us, this is problematic because this presents a conflict of interest of FAO. And now, right now in the crisis, what we need more urgently is a transition, phasing out synthetic pesticides, getting out of a system which is dependent on fossil fuels for doing agriculture. That is what we need. And then if we see that FAO is compromising on this because it has it's getting support for this business from this business industry, so we're wondering whether we will get the right responses. So it's extremely important also for the United Nations systems, FAO and all the agencies, to have a robust system of safeguards in place so that these organizations are not captured by corporate interests, because in our understanding, we need to review, to have major shifts in policy and norms right now. And I think this is the other shortcoming that we see in the Global Crisis Group. I think it's a very commendable effort. We agree on that. It's very important to try to get all the United Nations agencies working in a coordinated manner, but we need changes in policies. We need changes in the architecture, for instance, of agricultural trade. As I said, we need decisions of member states, of governments to cancel debt. We need decisions, for instance, to create a new UN tax agency so that we get, you solve also the issue of this extreme shortage of public funding. So we need to get an agreement, an international agreement to tax corporations, to close down tax havens, to stop illicit financial flows. So all this agenda is extremely important, and for that we need decisions from states, from member states, from public institutions to do so. So the UN Secretary General is not mandated to do so. We understand that. UN agencies are not mandated to do so. Member states are the ones who should drive this development, and therefore we need, and I would like to invite all the members of the World Council of Churches to put pressure on your governments, on other governments, to move ahead this agenda. It's very important to create new rules. We need global new rules which are really truthful to the principles of the UN Charter in terms of keeping peace. I think many of your members have raised the issue of this increased militarization of spending and of societies. This is extremely concerning, that the principle of non-using force, which was one of the most, if you want, sacred principles in the United Nations, is being destroyed, not only by Russia, but other countries before Russia. And you know very well which countries I am referring to. So this is very concerning. We also need to put into our agendas what are the structural causes of so much war, conflict, and violence, because this is what we are seeing everywhere. The systemic collapse, if you want, of our societies. And I think we need to start addressing what are the root causes of that. So therefore, finally, I would like to invite you to join the discussions in the Committee on World Food Security. I think this committee is complementary to the effort of the UN Secretary General, and it is complementary in the sense that member states can discuss and agree on how to change the rules, as I was saying, in this committee, in areas like, for instance, re-regulating financial markets, curbing speculation, fostering the creation of national and regional food reserves. That is an extremely important measure to deal with the problem of food price volatility. I think West Africa, the ECOWAS, has been doing important efforts in order to build regional food reserves in cooperation with the small scale farmers in West Africa. So it's an extremely important experience that needs to be replicated in other parts of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And I think it is so important that you have given this perspective and a people's perspective. And we know that we need to bring together these challenges, and of course it's our communities who have to raise these, and then faith communities are supposed to be the salt and the yeast of the world, for transformation. So we believe that each person who is sitting here has tremendous agency for this. And thank you so much, David, for sitting in and listening. And I think this is the way forward. We need to take this input back to the UN, and you are well placed. And you are our trusted ambassador for these things. And thank you so much for the time. Yes, I pass the word to you, David, before you leave.
Oh, just very quickly. Thank you, Sophia Monsalve. Thank you so much for your words. And it really thank you for connecting with us as we try to navigate this together, and for showing us the way. And thank you to Peter Prove, to Sylvain, and to you, Manoj, and to everybody. I'm sorry I have to go. I wish I could stay. I've just got somebody waiting. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Master, so much, David. Bye-bye. See you.
So thank you, David. And we will give you some time for if there are questions to Sophie, because Sophie has raised a lot of critical issues. And of course, we just, we cannot address this. And the point, what she raised was, she has given, we have the 2 documents, we have the Committee for Food Security. So the advice is, please involve in the Committee for Food Security and continue this conversation. But if you have, let's give a few minutes for some questions, critical questions. If anybody has a comment, or you can raise your hands, and then we can, and then you can proceed to speak. I think, Sophie, you have actually, said it all, and people are just, overwhelmed. And I don't think, because what you said is very clear. And if you can stay on, Sophie, it'll be great, because I think what we can listen to is that we have next, I think one person has raised the hands. Let me just, Thorsten, please. He's the director of programs of the ACT Alliance, and he's one of our resource persons. Please. Thorsten.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair Manoj, and Sophia. Very good to see you again. I have a question. Since David Navarro mentioned in his final remarks also about the need for basically the guiding star being the realization of the right to food, and of what you have mentioned in your words around the international architecture. And knowing that we've been working together, both Fian and myself and numerous other colleagues in the past, on the question of extraterritorial obligations on economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to food. Do you see any specific ways of applying extraterritorial obligations also in this specific crisis situation for realizing the right, or for improving the realization of the right to food? Does this give us any specific leverage or any additional lever of, at least I say, in terms of the international community's resolve to support a resolution or a longer term resolution of this crisis? Is there something that you would say, yeah, that could help us?
Yes, thank you very much, Thorsten, for that question. For sure, I think there are a couple of, in the IPES food report, for instance, we make a couple of suggestions about how to go about curbing speculation. One of the main problems that we have at the moment is that we don't know for sure how much stocks countries and corporations are holding. This is, for instance, nothing is forcing forcing these countries and corporations to disclose that information. Of course, we could apply the extraterritorial obligations understanding in order to call countries like Russia, of course, the United States, and many other agro exporting powers to tell us how many stocks they have. Now, this is one thing to do, and also to call them to bring their corporations, the corporations based in their countries, to also share and reveal that information. Because it's extremely important to know, for instance, when are we gonna face really a shortage? This is, for instance, one key issue. There is different evidence. As of now, FAO is saying we don't have a shortage. As of now, the problem may be next year. If the issue with the fertilizers, for instance, is not fixed, then we may see reduced, and we don't know new droughts and all this more climatic events may affect. So this is, for instance, one aspect, that in order to create a new regulatory framework for finances, we need to bring these states to cooperate. And this is a duty. This is actually an obligation of them, because the right to food is a human right, and they have to respect it not only in their countries, but for the international impacts that it has, such a regulation, for instance, of financial markets. So I really think that that is a very important argument to develop. and we hope that we can advance in that direction. Well, in the next time. Right now, there's a lot of discussions what to do, but this is, for instance, an important area where this could be done.
Thank you so much, Sophie. I mean, I think you have really brought and Thorsten, thank you so much for the question. Very, very vital question. Practically, how do we move forward? And Sophia pointed to some of those issues, and this is an ongoing discussion. Now, with your permission, Sophia, we'll go into the next section where we have brief interventions from colleagues from our networks, to get a sense. So I think, Thorsten, you had already the floor. So maybe, as the head of programs of ACT Alliance, and who's actually, facing and mobilizing support and actually has a finger on the pulse of a global situation, can you continue the input from your side? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, and I'll be really brief to make up for my earlier question at the time that I took with that. Very good to be with you all, friends, colleagues, sisters and brothers. Thanks a lot for this time, and for us as ACT Alliance, Action by Churches Together, as the global umbrella of those Protestant and Orthodox churches who work in humanitarian and development and advocacy work, to be part of this really excellent and stimulating conversation. We've been looking into what the impacts are on. We've been asked to look into what the impacts are on the humanitarian situation, humanitarian assistance situation in the countries in which ACT Alliance members operate. And I have to say, it's still pretty scarce information at this point in time of what we have received from members on the ground. But I think there are at least three dimensions that I would like to highlight, and that are also going a bit in the direction of what the earlier speakers have said. So first of all, I think the impacts are uneven and are also dependent on the level of dependency on wheat. In particular, as has been raised earlier, but not only on dependency on wheat, but also energy and fertilizer imports. What we see and what we hear from the ACT forums, which are the forums in which ACT Alliance members come together at the national level, is that we don't have reports on procurement shortages for food supplies at this point in time from many. But we're hearing the same from World Food Programme, who have been reporting considerable issues with procurement, as David Navarro has also mentioned earlier, and as David Beasley has said, we basically need to take food from the hungry to give it to the starving at this point in time because of the food assistance procurement shortages that the World Food Programme is facing. As I've said, from ACT members, that's not been the case across the board. I'll get to a couple of specific cases earlier. I would like to first highlight what has been mentioned earlier, that this current situation has been exacerbating pre-existing vulnerabilities and inequalities. You've heard it before from both David and from Sophia. There's a pretty good report from Oxfam recently out to the World Economic Forum that is describing the impacts on pre-existing inequalities. And I think David has also rightly mentioned the three big C's of COVID-19, climate change, and conflicts, which are exacerbating the situation. We've heard or seen from ACT members that this has been particularly the case in conflict-ridden countries, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Afghanistan, or Syria, where the impacts have been very strongly felt already there at two levels, I would say, and I think that's the second thing. That one is prices for food commodities, which have considerably increased, often also due to general inflation, and due to rising energy prices for the transport and procurement of the goods. We've heard from colleagues in Ethiopia who have said basically the grain price has increased by 100%, but transport prices also have increased by 30%. So that gives you about 130% price increase that you have been facing in the recent months. What we've heard from Nepal has been quite the opposite, but at the same level, with fuel price increases in the 80% and food price increases of 40 to 50%. So that's also probably because Nepal is not as dependent on wheat from Ukraine and Russia. We're seeing other impacts. Nigerian colleagues have reported that especially conversion rate to the US dollar deteriorated, which heavily increased import prices. And we've heard from Kenyan colleagues that availability of food as such is not yet the issue. However, accessibility and affordability are the two main problems that they are facing currently. Also because there seems to be considerable hoarding of food, combined with corruption ongoing, with people trying to hike prices intentionally in the current situation, and therefore benefiting from the current detrimental situation. I won't go into a couple of other situations, but I'd say there is a whole portfolio of influences on prices, but the price hikes are starting to be felt currently. And that's my third point. There are adjustments necessary now and for the medium term. In the immediate humanitarian assistance, we are seeing that many members are adjusting project budgets and are fortunately still able to compensate price increases. But adjusting budgets not only applies to buying food assistance directly, but also to cash assistance programming, where the cash amounts earlier distributed now are no longer sufficient to allow for basic commodities. I think the medium and longer term adjustments needed is a reduction of the use of fertilizers, as inputs are so much more expensive currently, and there might be positive side effects also towards a shift towards more agroecology that has also been mentioned earlier. But I would like to stress one last point from my side, and probably a bit contrary to what David Navarro has said earlier. While I fully agree with him that the solution can't be in supporting more people and making them more dependent on humanitarian assistance in the long term, and I'm fully on his line there. I think in the short to medium term, what we need is a much smarter and much more flexible interaction between humanitarian development funding needed. So to really deliver on the nexus conversation that we're having, to buffer the abrupt shocks, while at the same time working on the fundamental changes and shifts needed in the in the food security in the food security architecture that both Sophia and David and Navarro have mentioned earlier. Thank you. Over to you, Manoj.
Thank you, Thorsten. Thank you so much for giving us a global picture. And now I quickly move to Marvin Abrams, the founder of the program and the program coordinator of the Peter Maritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group from South Africa. He will actually, because they are, he leads a group which actually tracks the household affordability index and regularly publishes the food prices and affordability of food for all sections of society in South Africa. And he is a go-to person for everybody, government, and his network, and he works with a wide group of people doing great work and literally, advises governments and the public. So over to you, Marvin.
So thank you, Manoj. And I'll be very quick. I would like to say that actually all the input so far really deals with the nub of the issue. And really, there isn't that much more to say from a global level, but perhaps just to give a localized picture. So in South Africa, to look at it from the South African perspective, we have seen food prices spike since the beginning of COVID, and that has continued. So yes, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has has sharpened the spike. But the issue around increasing food prices have been with us for quite a while. And so we have seen, for instance, a basket of 44 very basic foods that low-income households, the most vulnerable, will purchase. It has increased over the past year by close to 8%, while wages and salaries have increased between 4 and 5%. So it raises, therefore, a massive affordability crisis. If I could just say that for a country like South Africa, availability of food is not an issue. You know, we have food security at national level. In fact, South Africa is a major exporter of food. So availability of food is not an issue. Accessing food through means of the supermarket, of course, is where the pricing plays a role. And so seeing prices across staples like sunflower increasing by 42%, chicken, which is an important protein in South Africa, increased by 13%, seeing bread increasing by close to 10%, which is also a major staple. All of that has major impact on the most vulnerable sectors of society. And so we have seen, for instance, in South Africa, reported, for instance, that 199 children under the age of 5 in our public hospital system has died as a direct result of malnutrition in only the first 2 months of this year, so January and February of this year. Now we know that if that's the official statistic, then of course the statistic is the reality is much larger. We've heard a lot about the global factors, and yes, I fully agree, and the global systemic inequalities and structural problems. But I just want to say one thing, that the need to go local, as Sophia has spoken, and the need to strengthen and to lessen our exposure to global factors like conflicts and pandemics and so on, of course, is true. But part of the global financial architecture is that, so for instance, in a country like South Africa that is food secure with regard to, for instance, maize, which is our main staple. But if the prices of maize globally increase, then even the local prices tend higher on the basis of export, because farmers would rather export than sell locally. And so the local prices increase. So there's an interplay between the global and the local in terms of our financial infrastructure that we definitely need to explore further. And then basically just to say that from our perspective, what is required in the midst of this current pandemic, and I totally agree with Sophia that this crisis started in 2007, and how we deal with this crisis today. We cannot deal again in the same way as we did in 2007 by just facilitating even the greater corporatization of food in the global system, and that partly has led us to this problem. So we really do need to find alternatives now, so that we don't come back in 2 years' time and into even a greater crisis. So what do we require? It seems to us that an emergency response to get food to people who suffer today is critical, and it is real, and we believe that that is where churches can help, because churches reach so many people across the globe. We do need to focus around our food system, and I've heard about agroecology. Sophia mentioned it, David mentioned it. That definitely has to be strengthened, and localized food systems has to be strengthened, and local reserve capacity for food needs to be strengthened, so that we are not at always dealing with this food price volatility. But at the end of the day, the one issue that wasn't mentioned, I don't think it was mentioned in our discussion today, and that is the unintended consequence of biofuels as a response to climate change. And so many of our cereals produced end up in car tanks as fuel, And of course, that also increased the commodity prices globally for those who wish to eat that food. So we are definitely also going to have to bring in the question of biofuels strategy and its impact in causing increased commodity prices. It seems to us that the poorest part of the world is being pushed further and further in backwards due to food crisis, because it's not only about hunger and about human development. Human development is critical for economic development. So if human development goes backwards because of hunger and malnutrition, then of course there is also this whole cycle of your economic development going backwards. And so we need to look at this as a holistic. It is both human, of course, it's hunger today, respond to that, but in the long term, it will deepen poverty cycles, and in the long term, it will keep the South poorer and stop economic development in some of these poorest countries. So I think that's all I wish to say at this stage, Manoj. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Marvin, for this, and for really giving an analysis from a very local perspective in South Africa. But of course, South Africa has a huge impact all over the continent of Africa. Now, I quickly would like to invite Reverend Nick Telubale, who is the General Secretary of the Organization of African Institute Churches based in Kenya. He leads an absolutely stellar organization. In a way, it's indigenous African churches, which represents around 60 million members, over 10,000 AIC, that's African Institute Church denomination across sub-Saharan Africa. They really are preaching and practicing what they preach. They are assisting farmers. They have got programs implementing a livelihoods program. So let's hear from him how they are responding to this crisis and what's their take on it.
Thank you so much, Manoj, and to all the colleagues who are participating in this meeting and the presenters who have come before me. I'll take simply a few minutes. The issue is that we agreed to work on a world without hunger by 2030. And that is almost a global compact that we have on our hands in the SDGs. I'll pick up simply two indicators in goal number 2 and speak from that. 2.3, double agriculture productivity of small food producers. And then indicator 2.4, by 2030, ensure sustainable food production systems, and that includes issues of ecology and all that. If we take those two indicators and bring in all the others, the gender dimension, the generation dimension that brings in youth and children, the elderly, then we move forward. If we double the productivity of smallholder farmers, let me talk about Africa, who produce over 70% of the food, then it means we are dealing with the situation, the state of food insecurity. I agree with Sophia that the war in Ukraine has aggravated the situations, but the issues we've been dealing with have come with us for a long time. So what do we do in this situation as churches? I'll talk about the OAIC, what we are doing in the East African region. We have a program of reaching 30,000 smallholder farmers directly through congregations to improve their food production. What are we finding? We are finding that even in areas where no disaster has been declared, there is insufficient food. For example, in February, I was in northern Uganda, and the Acholi region in northern Uganda, in the Uganda Bureau of Statistics release of June 2021, 80% of the households are in state of food poverty. And this is not yet declared a disaster, because as David was saying, it's patched all over. We can say it's COVID, but much of it was climate related issues. So what should we be looking at? Let's pull together issues around COVID, the post-COVID, issues around the climate change, issues around low financing for the agriculture sector, issues around the industrialization of agriculture, the gender and generational dimensions, and then have a holistic response as churches. What do we need to do? Number one, quickly, farmers need access to quality seeds. There are vegetables which can mature in 3 weeks. We have done it and it works. Where there is water, you need 20 liters of water there. I'm talking about areas where there is water, and I'll get back to that because there are areas which are also in water scarcity. Deal with the whole issue of post-harvest handling. How do we accept a situation of being in hunger, yet farmers, smallholder farmers in some countries are reaching simply 40% of their potential in production, yet they lose 30% of what they produce? Those are practical issues we can be dealing with. Then improving access to agriculture extension services. We are talking, Sophia, thank you for talking about 2008, but we need to roll back to the late 1980s and early 1990s, the structure adjustment programs, the agricultural extension systems and other areas, agricultural subsidies haven't rolled back in many of the developing countries. We are still working in many countries with the commercialized agricultural extension systems as a result of the structured adjustment programs. We need to roll back even almost over 25 years for us to deal with some of the issues. The other area we need to deal with is climate resilience, not simply in meetings, but in action. We have tried it out. We knew that the rains were going to be short, and many farmers who are relying on maize, corn, it takes at least 3 months. And we've provided options, not taking away maize, but they've moved on to plant legumes, which are maturing in 60 days instead of 3 months, so that they can have access to food. So what am I saying? Number one, churches have a role to practically empower the farmers and accompany the farmers. If we can find money for us to move and baptize people, for us to move and do evangelism, for us to build churches, we can find money to invest in hunger, even locally, in ending hunger, even with local resources, but also with the partnerships. We need to deal with the issue of climate resilience. Adaptation is key. And this has to deal with financing. Now, that's why we get to policy at the global level. The financing levels are low, but that is coupled sometimes with the corruption and systems which are not supporting farmers well. Financing is needed at the local level. Strengthening governance and monitoring of resources is needed so that the farmers can have access to these resources. How do I end? Number one, there is a lot of search for resources for financing for relief. We need financing for adaptation also. It is key and practically reaching the farmers. Number two, we need to make sure that the farmers are supported in adaptation to climate change. Number three, we need to make sure that public policy at the national level and the subnational level up to the local level is responsive to the needs of smallholder farmers, for whom target number three is about doubling agricultural production. Number three, another issue we need to deal with, we need to make sure that we are working towards food sovereignty. Sophia has been talking about that. We need to break the chain of dependence. Smallholder farmers need the support to take charge, number one, of production and sharing of seeds in their mechanisms. Number two, of making sure that they are storing their harvest well. Number three, that they have a voice in shaping public policy from the local level to the national level, but also at the international level. So I think what I'm saying is what is before us, there is a role the churches can play at the local level, invest in smallholder farmers. The churches can play a role in influencing policy at all levels, from the local to the international level. And finally, in our statement as Faith Communities of Africa in the year 2014, as we were working towards shaping the SDGs, the statement from the Africa Faith Leaders Initiative was from lament to action. Let's make sure that as we talk about these issues, we are not ending in lament only. We are ending up with action. Change the life of a smallholder farmer, and you are changing nations. You are changing the lives of children, of women, of mothers, and of everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Reverend Nikta. Thank you so much. I don't need to say anything more. Words which are coming from a practitioner, a leader practitioner. Now, friends, we have only 4 more minutes. With your permission, can we kindly extend this meeting for another 10 minutes? So we will definitely conclude with a 10-minute, because we have our colleagues have other programs. So we will have just 2 more inputs and then we will summarize. Katligo Mahuba is a youth activist from the Food for Life campaign from South Africa, a student. And I want her input as a student. What is the challenge that you are facing all over the world? So what are students facing?
All right. Thank you, Manoj. And my context is also from South Africa, but focusing on the challenge faced by youth and students in South Africa. So historically, food insecurity in South Africa was a rural, was seen as a rural problem. And so the focus in terms of addressing it was seen as a food availability issue and framed with association to rural development. And so even today, policies that inform our resolutions take this approach. But we know that in a country like ours, 60% of the country is urbanized and 40% of the population is youth. And so the real challenge of food or hunger, food poverty, or food insecurity is really accessibility and not so much affordability as it has been thought of historically. And so because we are increasingly urbanizing and we are 60% urbanized, we are now relying on the market to obtain food. And so income is a key determinant of food security in that context. And so this naturally presents a problem for the youth and for students who do not have guaranteed income, who are unable to plan for the purchase and for the preparation of their food. And so in part, in South Africa, the increasing urbanization is a challenge, but another part of it is the structural unemployment crisis faced by South Africa, where 65.5% of South Africa's youth of working age are unemployed for long periods of time, even after obtaining university degrees. And this informs the absence of reliable income, which impacts their ability to afford and purchase food from the market. An additional burden is that many of those individuals are also primary caregivers in their households. And so they also have to manage the expectation of providing basic needs, such as foods, not only for themselves, but also for those who depend on them. And so in the context of youth who are also students, many of them do not have food, shelter, and other basic needs because they come from impoverished backgrounds. And so they don't have these necessities in time to settle in at university and in time to start the academic program. But the other reason relates to the general reason affecting many of our poor students in South Africa, which is the reliance on the National Student Financial Aid Scheme for financing of their studies and related needs. And the challenge there is often that the allowances are delayed and students go months without money for necessities. So what then students do and what youth do in attempt to finance their needs and to be able to afford and access food is engage in some dangerous behavior. And one of that is called survival sex, which is a form of prostitution engaged in by a person because of the extreme vulnerability and need for basic needs such as food, amongst other things, in exchange for their body. And so in responses like these, we see the intersectionality of food, of gender, and of unbalanced power relations between youth and students that are in need, that are vulnerable, and those who can or should provide these basic needs for them to continue to study or to continue to live with dignity. So the challenges that are faced by youth and students are multi-sectional and require, as Sophia and other colleagues have pointed out, a look at the core causes of the problem and also the effects that this food poverty may have on each individual and each student. And maybe it may, the solutions that they as individuals may come up with put them in more vulnerable and more dangerous positions because they are attempting to access and afford food. And so I want to invite us to share and work together to correctly diagnose the challenges of food, hunger with youth, and collaborate on an urgent response to this food crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katlego. Now we will have an input from Professor Esther Mambo, who has given an input, brief theological reflection. Let's hear what she has to say from St. Paul's Theological University.
Greetings. I wish to thank the organizers of this webinar, especially Dr. Manoj, for asking me to participate. I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you because of a family commitment, but I'm sending my short reflection on this important subject of hope, solidarity, and courage amid the global food crisis. A mother was heard to say, "Before Corona kills us, hunger would have killed us." This voice can be reflected in different contexts where people are struggling with hunger. The blame for hunger is given as COVID, as war, and other things. But this is not the whole truth, because hunger is linked to many other issues of power, domination, and economic injustice. Theologically, we know and believe that God created the world and abundantly provided everything needed to sustain life. God also gave humans the responsibility to weed, prune, and inhabit the earth and feed from it. Today, as a result of human greed, the production, distribution, and consumption of food are no longer based on equality, socially and environmentally sustainable agriculture, and economics which prioritize the welfare of all people. The prophetic tradition of the Old Testament, in the words of Prophet Jeremiah, reminds us this vividly when it says, "I brought you into a plentiful land to eat its fruits and its good things. But when you entered, you defiled my land and made my heritage an abomination." Jeremiah 2, verse 7. The story of Jesus feeding 5,000 people has some lessons for us as we face the hunger crisis in different parts of the world. First, there is enough food to feed everybody in the world. When Jesus saw a crowd of people, he told his disciples to give them food. When we provide food to the hungry, we are not doing them a favor, but acting as expected of us by God. As God's people through Jesus Christ, we cannot ignore the reality of hunger in our world. We cannot sit by while millions starve. Like the disciples of Jesus, we are prone to send away the hungry with lots of reasons why we can't feed them. The story of Jesus feeding 5,000, however, reminds us that we share what is available. There is in this world enough food to feed our hunger, but not enough to feed our greed. In Jesus' case of feeding 5,000, everybody who was available ate, those who were hungry and those who were not. We also note that the people ate no more than they needed. they even had 12 baskets of leftover food. Feeding the hungry is a mission and a witness to God's mercy to us all. It is the hope we share in God's faithfulness. It is important, therefore, that we feed those that are hungry and in need. In Isaiah 58, verse 10, God promised that if God's people would feed the hungry and help those in trouble, then their light would shine out from darkness. The same is true today, that we join in fighting hunger. Not only will millions receive the help they desperately need, but also the world will see the light of Christ shining through us. We will be walking in the prophetic and Jesus tradition and dealing with this human-made crisis of hunger. We have hope because lack of hope leads to a loss of vision and a sense of despondency and ultimately despair. We have hope that we will deal with this crisis because it is this hope that gives us confidence and reassurance in the present life, allowing us to lead effective lives for God and to work against the crisis of hunger by giving those who are hungry food. Amen.
Thank you so much, Esther. We will, as a last word, I would like to hand over to Silva Nedelec, who's our the intern for the Food for Life campaign. Please, Silva, can you tell us, okay, what now? What are you doing? What are you doing? What are we doing from WCC?
Okay, thank you, Manoj. I will talk about how we work at the WCC. So in order to understand and analyze the impact of this global crisis on people, we have set up a research project to monitor and support the situation among faith communities. So what we are doing is firstly monitoring food insecurity at the community level to channel the information to the United Nations. Secondly, follow up to strengthen the flow of input we receive from the workstream and our communities to inform and conscientize communities on challenges and possible solutions. Then facilitate advocacy for policy change at the leadership level. Moreover, to prepare periodic status reports, which can be used to update our member churches and our networks on the situation and to offer channels to receive their experiences, which can be shared with the workstream. So finally, based on the input and stories we receive and key messages that are needed to be conveyed, we plan periodic updates. So as I said, we have set up a research project. This research work is based on qualitative and quantitative data. We have set up a series of interviews and we use the statistical data from international organizations to analyze the effect of the crisis on the population. We want to have an holistic approach to this crisis, and we have to understand that the consequences of the war in Ukraine are part of a larger and more global framework. We should not have a reductionist approach to this conflict and its consequences. That's why we also focus on society itself. We need to understand the social, the political, the economic, and the cultural inequalities. We also need to focus on the state and how they have been built, but also not to forget the effect of the COVID-19 and the climate disruption. What we need to understand is that is the already vulnerable population that are the most severely affected. So conflict is a major driver of food insecurity, but the causal relationship between violent conflict on the one hand and food insecurity and famine on the other are complex and context-driven. In this contribution and in this work, our aim is to show that food insecurity is not only a byproduct of war, but that it stands in the center of the logic of violent conflicts. Local response mechanisms to food crises and conflict need to be better understood, both in the scientific literature and within international organizations. For this reason, we hope that this research work based on faith-based organization will allow us in the future to better understand the logics of food insecurity in communities in relation to the war. So thank you for listening to me. Manoj, I give it the floor.
Thank you so much, Silva. I think we have run our time, but just to know that we have set in a process and we want you to be contacting and letting us know how you have been, how things are happening, and also for us to listen to you so that we can convey the lessons and the wisdom that you have received so that we can share it widely. Thank you very much for all that you have, for all those who have attended. We will compile your information. We will make our weekly reports public. We will also share the recording with you of this. And we need to continue. We need to continue, friends, because it is not the evidence that we gather is to mobilize our people, because knowledge is, for what is knowledge if we cannot make a difference in this world? Let us make a difference in the world because the churches have the mandate to do that. Thank you so much for your precious time. Thank you, each and every one of you, and also the resource persons. May God bless you. So let me just conclude with a word of prayer. Lord, thank you, Father, for this time. Bless this, all the people who have attended. Mobilize us. Help us to change the framework of this world, which is taking us towards hunger and poverty. Liberate us, strengthen us, make us channels of your blessing in this world, and help us to strive for the reign of God to be established here and now through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you, friends. I hope to follow up, and I will send you an email to you with all the recording and the links and the documents that we have. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.